Thank you. Number is going to be
Okay, welcome to WeREndurance webinar series. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Matt Fitzgerald. Matt is the author of many running and endurance books, and he is one of my faves, so I'm very excited that he's here. Without further ado, Matt, maybe you want to talk a little bit about your background and about the new book. And
Sure thing. Yeah, and I do have slides. Would you like me to? I can.
Yeah, perfect.
My intro and then share my screen.
You got it.
Right on. Well, hopefully technology won't. Well, hopefully I won't let down technology is the better way to put it. Yeah. So my background is I have been running pretty much my entire life. Started at age 11, inspired by watching my father finish the 1983 Boston Marathon. And also my father's a writer. And so I got both the running and the writing bugs from him. Did not anticipate growing up to write about running. I knew I wanted to write, but that's the way it worked out. Got into triathlons in the late 90s. And started coaching in 2001, became a certified sports nutritionist in 2006, started my company 80/20 Endurance officially in 2016. So those are the hats I wear. I'm an endurance sports writer, coach, nutritionist, and entrepreneur. And yeah, keeps me busy, but I love it. It's just all rooted in a passion. So that is me. And yeah, so I'll share my screen here and we can take a deep dive into, let's see, where is it?
On the bottom, there's a green button.
Yeah, I've got it wants to do my whole desktop and I just want to do.
Oh, you might want to open it first. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, it is open. Oh, we'll get there. So
Excuse me.
okay, and then I need to go to, whoops. Need to go to present mode, right? Enter full screen or slideshow. Boom. There we go. Is that working? Full screen?
Yes.
Beautiful. Right on. Whoops. Oh no, it's I need to back out of this because I think it's going to automatically fast forward. Hope not. Yeah, so the subject is pacing. And so I wrote an entire book about pacing. And I think many athletes would think, how? But I've been fascinated by the subject for a long time. I think it's like one of these loose threads in a sweater. Like it just seems like a tiny loose thread, but if you pull on it and keep pulling, eventually the entire sweater unravels. And so for me, like the subject of pacing, is just an entry point for kind of a new understanding of what endurance sports are. And of course, there is practical relevance too, because it is, I think, the quintessential skill in endurance sports. So without further ado, I'm going to give you my take on this fascinating subject. Quick overview of the ground we'll cover, and I will be brisk about it, leave time for questions. I'm first going to define pacing. Pacing is one of those things that's so familiar that we fail to properly appreciate it. I think a lot of learners would actually struggle to define pacing. So we'll do that, talk about how it works. The science, about what pacing is and how it works is pretty darn fascinating. Then we'll talk about why most runners suck at pacing. From my coaching perspective, this is just true. It's not an insult. It's just most of us have some work to do on this skill. Then we'll pivot to from a problem focus to a solution focus, talk about how to become better at pacing. And then I'll dismount with a little tangent into what I call macro pacing, and then I will take some questions. So this book cover you see here, it's from a book that came out, I think around 2012-ish, written by a couple of exercise scientists, and they flattered me by actually asking for me to write the foreword to this book. So if you buy a copy, you will see that I wrote the foreword to it, which always gives me a thrill, like when scientists take me seriously, because I am not a scientist. So they come up with a useful definition of pacing here, which is the goal-directed distribution and management of effort across the duration of an exercise bout. So that's pretty word dense, but I mean, it resonates with our intuitive understanding of what pacing is, right? Like we're apportioning, we have a certain amount of effort that we can devote to, a 20-minute run or a half marathon. And the idea of pacing is distributing that effort in sort of a goal-directed way. In the example of a race, you're trying to reach the finish line in the least time possible. So how do you distribute your effort in service of that goal? My more colloquial definition of pacing, sort of my operating definition of pacing for the book I wrote, is the art of finding your limit. You can pace in workouts, and of course, you're not really trying to find your limit in workout. So this is sort of a competition-specific definition of pacing. That's what you're really trying to do, right? Like when you complete a race, you want to look back and say, I found my limit in that race. Like there's nothing I could have done differently that would have enabled me to get to the finish line more quickly. So, and I use the word art with intention here, as it really is. It is more of an art than a science, though there is some science behind it. So, pacing is, it is the thing that makes endurance sports. And this is another thing that, the average athlete kind of fails to appreciate, because like if we're focusing on running here, there are forms of running that are not endurance running, right? And what the science shows us, like take, we've got Usain Bolt here, who holds the world records for, I guess, did he lose his 200? Well, he still has the 100 world record. And so you look at a race that's that short, there is no pacing involved. Like the goal is the same, whether it's a 100-meter dash or a marathon. You're trying to reach the finish line in the least time possible. But tactically, how you achieve that goal differs depending on how long the race is. So for a 100-meter dash, you get to the finish line as quickly as possible by producing a maximal effort all the way through, from the beginning to the end. But as races get longer, there's a critical threshold at which starting all out and continuing all out the entire way is not actually the quickest way to reach the finish line. So if we're talking about world-class athletes, people who are very highly conditioned, that occurs somewhere around 45 seconds. So if you're going to run a race that's say, going to last about a minute, if you fail to hold back a little bit, if you fail to voluntarily restrain your effort, you will not reach the finish line. If you go all out, you'll end up exhausting yourself, so that you're slowing down so much in the latter part of the race that you actually, it's a little bit counterintuitive, right? You have to go slower in order to get there faster. And so that threshold occurs somewhere around 45 seconds. And, the reason is physiological, just like, interestingly, like even in a 100-meter sprint, the Usain Bolts of the world are starting to slow down before they reach the finish line in 100 meters. So like after only about 5 seconds, when you're trying to go as fast as you can, you're starting to lose speed, because you're just exhausting the physiological underpinnings of all-out efforts. Now, in a 10-second race, you're not slowing down enough that you're better off pacing, but you are slowing down. So that's why for longer races, the mechanisms of fatigue require you to voluntarily reduce your effort in order to reach the finish line as quickly as possible. This fellow here, Samuela Marcora, is an exercise physiologist, known, he's famous as the father of the psychobiological model of endurance performance. And it's really a sort of a pacing based theory of endurance performance. I basically, he knows more than I do about this stuff. And so I basically, like, his theory of pacing is my theory of pacing, like in terms of like, okay, we understand what it is, but how does it actually work? How do we do it? Pacing, according to Sam Marcora's model, is based on 5 different things. The first is perception of effort. You really are pacing by feel. And, perception of effort is just an athlete's global sense of how hard they're working relative to their limit. So, I can interrupt any athlete at any point during any workout or race and say, how hard are you working right now? What is your perception of effort? And they can answer that question. They might do it with a number on a 1 to 10 scale or some other scale. They might do it with words, but this is like, this perception exists. It is as distinct and real a perception as like the ability to perceive hot and cold or pain or a tickle. It's just like, it is a distinct perception. Like we are able to perceive how hard we're working in the exercise context relative to our limits. So that's one. The second is potential motivation, which is a fancy way of saying, like, basically how much we're willing to suffer or how much we're willing to invest in the pursuit of a goal. I think we've all, any athlete with any degree of experience knows that, like, they tend to perform better in races when they're more motivated. So, obviously how fit you are will affect your performance in a big way, but also how motivated you are. You can, because you're racing by feel and you're going by perception, perceptual limits are real. Like, everyone has a limit to how much pain they can tolerate, and everyone has a limit to how much effort they can tolerate. But it's sort of a squishy limit, right? Because it is perceptual. So the more motivated you are, the further you can push into the pain cave before you decide, you know what, I've had enough. So that's number 2. Number 3 is conscious knowledge of how far you have to go, right? Like, if you started a race and you didn't know how long it was, you would have a hard time pacing yourself. So take a very long race like a marathon. When you run the first 100 meters of a marathon, you're deliberately choosing a pace based on your conscious knowledge of how far you have to go. So that's another factor. And obviously, like, in effect, as you make your way through a long race, the race gets shorter and shorter. So, eventually a marathon becomes a 100-meter race, when you're with 100 meters of the finish line. So it's very helpful for pacing if you are consciously aware of how far you have to go. That will also influence your pacing decisions. And then the final piece is experience and your memory of all those past experiences when you were pacing yourself through efforts. Like, it's, experience calibrates your pacing mechanism. So, a very experienced runner like me can be, 4K into a 10K race and just, sort of check into how I'm feeling and have some basis for knowing, like, yeah, this is how I should feel 4K into a 10K race. An absolute beginner can't do that because they don't have that reservoir of experience. So, in this day and age, like, with all these, these wearables and devices we have, like, there's a tendency for athletes to think, like, why can't my Garmin do it for me? Isn't there some calculator that can just guarantee, like, this is what you can do in this race on this day? And, all you have to do is, paint by numbers, connect the dots, and it's all taken care of. It doesn't work like that. And the thing, another thing, I keep using this phrase, but another thing that the average athlete, fails to appreciate is just how similar the skill of pacing is to other sports skills. Pacing is just, it's just another form of controlling your body in space. So when we look at another sport, in a blog post I wrote, I used golfing as an example versus, this football example here. But, like, if you watch, one of the, the Masters tournament on TV with the best male golfers in the world, competing for the ultimate prize in the sport. You can have a player whose caddy says, okay, it's like your second shot on a par 4, and the caddy will tell the player, okay, it's 108 yards to the hole. And then the player will line up and shoot the ball, and it's going to come very close to 108 yards, right? Like give or take a few feet in either direction. Well, how did the golfer shoot the ball that accurately just based on the caddy telling them how far to shoot it? Well, it wasn't a Garmin, it wasn't a calculator, it wasn't a formula of any kind. They just did it by controlling their body in space. Like they know how far 108 yards is. They're doing it completely by feel, like just, the degree of wind up, the amount of tension that the golfer puts into their swing is going to vary like infinitesimally by the tiniest of degrees, depending on whether the caddy says it's 104 yards, it's 108 yards, it's 112 yards. Like those fine grained distinctions actually matter, to like a very experienced high level golfer. And they can actually feel the difference between a 104 yard swing and a 108 yard swing. And so pacing in endurance sports is no different. If you look at the top endurance athletes in the world, the people who are winning Olympic medals and setting national records, if you give them a pacing challenge, I experienced this when I trained with the NAZ Elite Professional Running Team in Flagstaff a number of years ago. When the coach said to, a group of the guys, I want you to run this next mile in 4:36, they ran that mile in 4:36. And if it was 4:34, the coach was pissed because the expectation, like they could do better than that. And they seldom missed a target by more than, in percentage terms, 0.02%. So it's possible to be that good, and it's not magic. And there is not, nor will there ever be a wearable device that can do that job before us. The reason is because the limit of endurance performance again is based on perception. So and there's been research showing this, like when an endurance athlete hits the point of exhaustion in any type of test, where they cannot continue any further or cannot continue at their present pace, physiologists have measured everything that's going on in the body in different types of exercise tests at the point of exhaustion. And there's absolutely no consistency whatsoever in terms of what is happening. Scientists cannot find a definitive physiological mechanism of fatigue in the endurance context. Like they look at blood lactate levels, but exhaustion occurs at different blood lactate levels. They look at muscle cell depolarization. Endurance fatigue exhaustion occurs at different levels of muscle cell depolarization. You can go up and down the line. Muscle glycogen levels, core body temperature, heart rate, on and on and on, breathing rate. There's no like absolute inflexible physiological trigger of exhaustion. The only thing that is absolutely consistent when an athlete says, I'm out, I can't continue any longer, is that their perception of effort is maximal. So to feel you cannot continue is to not be able to continue. And that's sort of like the bottom line reason why your Garmin doesn't know how you feel. It's not making that decision. So like you basically quit voluntarily always in the endurance context. This is sort of a bad news story for the athletes out there who sort of just wish their Garmin would do it for you, but it's a good news story in the sense that like it gives you, if you embrace that fact, it gives you a competitive advantage. Because while the athlete to your right and the athlete to your left are complaining about the fact that Garmin won't pace for them, you can start working to develop that skill so that you're better at pacing than the people in your age group that you're trying to compete against. So just an example of what, just as the slide says, what does perfect pacing look like? Because, pacing can be done either very poorly or exceedingly well. There's a whole spectrum, right? So if we go up to the, what are we actually trying to achieve? in the effort to pace optimally. There's been some, this graph you see. So the woman on the left is Letizabeth Gaudet, who holds the world record for 5,000 meters. And the graph you see on the right is a summary of research on the relationship between perception of effort and time elapsed or distance covered in races of different distances. So these are all, I think they're actually cycling based. So what you see here is like on the x-axis, it's rate of perceived effort. So it's I don't know why it's on 11-point scale, but so like, and then on the y-axis you see percentage of race covered. So all these separate lines represent races of very different distances, all the way from 5K in the low end all the way up to 100K on the high end. And what you see is the longer the race is, the lower the initial perception of effort is, right? Like you run the first 100 meters of a marathon much slower than the first 100 meters of a 5K, right? Because you know how far you have to go. So perception of effort starts off at different places depending on how long the race is. But look what happens over time as you move forward from 10% of the way to the finish line to 20% to 30%. Perception of effort increases very linearly. You see, like these lines are almost straight upward, trending upward, and they converge because maximal perceived effort is maximal perceived effort. It's like maximal pain tolerance. It's like your limit is your limit. So it doesn't matter how long you've been running or what your starting point was. When you get to the point where when you feel like I cannot work any harder than this, like I either cross the finish line now or I quit now, one or the other. And that's where you see they all end up at exactly the same point. What's missing from this this graph is it would be nice if they actually showed pace or velocity or power output as well, because what you'll see is in a perfectly executed race, your actual speed remains very, very steady all the way through. So whether you're racing 5K, 10K, 40K, or 100K, if you're optimally pacing a race of any of those distances, your actual output will remain very, very consistent, but your perceived effort increases linearly at that steady output. And the reason is why? Because you're fatiguing. You're fatiguing progressively as you go. So the same speed feels harder and harder the more fatigued you become. So like, that's what you're trying to achieve in a race. And there is some fine print, some nuance, like, is absolute perfect consistency in pace or power or whatever, the definition of perfect pacing? Almost certainly not. First of all, it's impossible. You can't find any world record performance that was achieved with absolutely consistent pacing all the way through. You can have bad patches in races, right? When you actually need to maybe back off a little bit. And of course, there's topography, wind, factors like that, tactics. But basically, so there's the exceptions, right? In races of like 800-meter races, it's notorious that there's like optimal pacing is actually a positive split where you're actually involuntarily slowing down toward the end. Same thing at ultra marathon distances. Even the Jim Walmsleys of the world are slowing down involuntarily 90 miles into a 100-mile race. But those departures from absolute consistency are often overplayed. They're very small. And if you look at examples of poor pacing versus examples of excellent pacing, the difference is always that poor pacing is inconsistent. It's erratic. There are a lot of fluctuations, and good pacing is very, very consistent with some undulations. There's a couple different reasons for that. One is that as you increase your speed or intensity, your speed can increase linearly, but you actually hasten the approach of exhaustion exponentially or actually geometrically. So when you stray above, it's like, the metaphor people use is burning matches. Anytime you stray above the fastest pace you're capable of sustaining over a given race distance, you're burning a match and you're accelerating the approach of fatigue, and you can't undo that. You can look at your watch and say, oh dear, I'm running faster than I should, and slow down. Too late. I mean, it's not too late, but you've already done some damage by going into kind of the orange zone. where you just, every time you burn a match, you're that much closer to exhaustion. Also, for pure physics reasons, acceleration is expensive. Acceleration wastes energy. So anytime you stray below the fastest pace you can sustain and then accelerate to a faster pace, you're burning another match. So those are the two main reasons that consistency in your distribution of effort is what you're aiming for in pacing. Now we'll talk about why most runners suck at pacing. And it goes for triathletes as well, cyclists. This is a comic that's actually included in my book on pacing. It's from Mark Remy of Dumb Runner fame. I love it. It speaks to the epidemic of device dependency that we're dealing with in the contemporary endurance sports environment. So there are three main reasons that, and I speak as a coach, like, virtually every athlete I work with could be better at pacing. Number one is that pacing is inherently difficult. It's like, look at the marathon again as an example. The average runner takes 55,000 strides in a marathon. And in order to finish a marathon and know with absolute certainty that you couldn't have completed that distance any faster, every single one of those 55,000 strides has to contribute to that goal. Every single one. Like, yeah, you can maybe mess up a stride or two, but basically like that is the level of precision you're aiming for. The analogy I make in the book is like, remember, was it last year or the year before that NASA landed that rover on the surface of Mars? It's like, Mars is however many million miles away from Earth, and the rover is the size of a sedan, and the landing spot they had to get that rover on was the size of, I don't know, like a football field or something. So like, I mean, it's just absolutely gobsmacking level of precision that was required to get that rover to land where they wanted it to on freaking Mars, for crying out loud. Well, pacing a marathon or another endurance race optimally requires a very similar level of precision, except you don't get to use physics and rocket science the way NASA does. You have to do it by feel. You have to do it by perception, weighed against experience and all, and the things we uncovered in that previous slide. So that's really hard. So every single one of us starts off sucking at pacing because it's inherently difficult. But experience is the best teacher. And one thing I've noticed is like, when I started running, when I was running in high school in the late 1980s, we didn't really talk a heck of a lot about pacing. But, fast forward to 2023, I've noticed that in my experience, because I've been involved in endurance sports for, 40 years now, is that the average runner has gotten worse at pacing. And I think a big reason for that is that the average runner starts much later. I started at 11. Most of the runners I coach started in their 30s or 40s, and that just means less experience. Like, we all get better at it with experience. And if you're just starting later, you don't have as much to fall back on. And also, people are more sedentary in their youth now. And so it's not just, you don't necessarily have to be racing cross country in high school to get relevant experience, but you do have to be active. So that's another reason. And then over dependence on devices is a big one as well. There's a blog post I wrote for the 80/20 endurance blog about a phenomenon I call cognitive offloading. So our brains are lazy. Like, anything that a computer or any external tool can do for us, we will lean on that tool, and then our own brains get worse at it. My dad and I so I mentioned my dad is a writer as well as I, and we had a conversation that we both agreed that we've gotten worse at spelling since we were in college, and we've gotten worse at spelling. We're both professional writers, but we've gotten worse at spelling. Why? Because of spell check. Because there's an external tool that will do it for you. So your brain just says, all right, I don't have to pay attention as deeply to how to spell words anymore. And you actually get worse at it. Pacing is the same way. If you're relying on your device to tell you what your limit is and how to distribute your effort in workouts and races, then it actually puts it slows the pace at which you develop. You actually get less benefit from experience because it's not on you. You're letting a tool do it for you. So in the book, I talk about a number of different ways to get better at pacing, and I guess the 5 major ones are as follow. One is effort-based training. The straw man version of the argument I make in my book on pacing is, oh, Matt says, running watches suck and you should all throw them in the ocean. Like, that is not what I'm saying. They're very useful. They're just easy any tool can become a crutch. So I'm not saying throw your Garmin in the ocean, but I am saying introduce some more effort-based training into your training, where it's like you either leave the device at home or you switch it to a mode where you're just looking at heart rate and you're not getting that performance feedback, and do some of your training where you're really just, and also leave the music at home too, and do some, like a certain percentage of your training where you are really just listening to your body and getting a better sense of, how you should be feeling. And like, even things like, what does an 8:37 mile pace feel like? Like, these things are knowable, but you're only going to know them if you are intentional about, sort of calibrating your perception of effort, and effort-based training is one way to do that. So I make an analogy. I'm a big fan of analogies. I make an analogy in the book between pacing and wine tasting. So there are kind of 2 ways to get better at tasting wines. One is to pick a certain varietal. Let's just say it's Malbecs, and taste like all kinds of different Malbecs, right? So you're actually, you're just taking one slice in the entire universe of different wines out there and just hitting it over and over and over again. Because when you do that, you're able to perceive nuances, right? So like, all Malbecs have a family resemblance to one another, but no 2 are the same, exactly the same. So when you just like do that specific repetition, as I call it, you get better at noticing those nuanced differences. And that's a way to get better at tasting wine. It's also a way to get better at pacing. So what I recommend athletes do is have certain bread and butter workouts. The workout has to have some clear benefit in terms of like your training goals. Don't just do something random repeatedly. But it could be something like, critical velocity intervals, which are great for any runner, and do that same workout or versions of that same workout often, like every 2, 3, 4 weeks. And when you do that, when you're repeating basically the same experience, you start to notice subtler and subtler things about it. And as you notice more of the nuances of the experience of that kind of workout, you gain more control over it. So you have a better sense of whether you're having a good day or a bad day, or of whether you've started off too hot in an interval or what have you. So that's one tool. The other tool, the next one, in terms of like my wine tasting analogy, is almost the exact opposite of that, where you actually throw curveballs at yourself, like different pacing challenges that are different from the usual thing. So in wine tasting, that means that you go all over the map. Blind taste tests with 12 different wines that have nothing, they're from different regions, different varietals, different ages, so on and so on. In training, so specific repetition is a little bit better for beginners or for people who have a long way to go to improve their pacing. Novel pacing challenges are a little bit like, once you've made some progress in your pacing, that's when you start to want to throw some more curveballs at an athlete. So they can take any of a number of forms. Like one that I really like, that I use often with the athletes I coach, is what I call long accelerations. It's actually stolen from an eminent French exercise physiologist named Véronique Balat. And we've probably all done short accelerations before. They're similar to strides, where you start at a jog and accelerate to a sprint over 15 seconds. Long accelerations, you're trying to accelerate progressively without interruption for anywhere from 3 to 11 minutes. So let's take the upper end of that. Imagine going out, warming up, and then starting at your normal easy run pace, and then trying to accelerate to a full sprint over 11 minutes. So that's a long time, but the rule is you have to be accelerating nonstop all the way through. So what that forces you to do is really pay attention to both your perception of speed, just how fast am I moving right now? Am I actually accelerating? Because you're accelerating because you only have so much room to work with, right? Between a jog and a full sprint. And if you if you start to accelerate too quickly, you're going to run out of gears before 11 minutes are up. So it's a cool workout because it's an unusual workout where you're actually hitting every single intensity across the entire spectrum, which very, very few workouts do. So it's very beneficial physically, but it's really mentally stimulating as well, because you really have to concentrate. And then what you go through, actually, I'll jump ahead to number 5, decision tracking. When you do these long acceleration workouts, what you do is you go home and then look at the workout graph, your pace or power graph afterwards, and see how well you did. And what you want to avoid, what you don't want to see, are dips. You want to see, perfect execution would be like a straight upward trending line where you truly are gradually accelerating all the way through. And if you see dips, that means your points are deducted. And you also don't want to see plateaus where you're neither speeding up or slowing down. You do that. Every runner I've ever introduced this workout to gums it up the first time. It's like, it's just, it's a novel pacing challenge. That's what it is. But with practice, you get better at it. And it's not just a way of gamifying training. It makes you better at pacing. But jumping ahead to decision tracking, that's when there was interesting research that I found involving speed skaters, where they looked at the development of elite speed skaters from the junior level, so like early teens, all the way up to the senior level, like the Olympics. And they looked at their improvement in pacing skill. And interestingly, the ones, because if you're an elite junior speed skater, there's no guarantee you're going to the Olympics as an adult. The ones who actually stayed on top over time were the ones who exhibited the most improvement in pacing. And the ones who exhibited the most improvement in pacing were the ones who actively evaluated their pacing performance after races and workouts. So I mentioned that experience is the best teacher, but not all experience is equal. It's actually reflecting on and evaluating experience that is the best teacher. So, you can go out and, do a race and, maybe the pacing is a B+. Well, you're not going to get as much out of that if you just say, oh, well, I'll try better next time and move on. But if you actually sit down and reflect on why was it a B+ and not an A+, you learn you extract a little bit more of a lesson from that performance that you can then apply in the next one. So, I jumped ahead to decision tracking because I was giving, your analysis of the workout graph after doing long accelerations is an example of that. Don't just do the workout, sit down and evaluate it and come away with okay, here's how I think I can do better next time. And then next time apply that lesson, and it will just accelerate your experience-based learning. And then the final one, which is actually number 4, is limit testing. I mentioned that my colloquial definition of pacing is the art of finding your limit. And so, where is your limit, right? We don't start off knowing that. There's a study I describe in my book involving, I think they were 10, 11-year-old kids about the age I started running. And they had the kids do 3 800-meter races. And these were kids who had never done an 800-meter race before. So this was a novel pacing challenge for them. And they did them on separate occasions, but relatively close together, so that they're getting in shape was not going to affect whether their performance in these 800-meter races. And what the researchers found is that when the kids did these 3 800-meter races, their performance improved each time, even though they weren't training. So their performance in these races did not improve because they were getting fitter, because they weren't getting fitter. What the researchers expected was that their performance would improve because they actually got better at pacing. They got better at holding back early on, but actually that didn't happen. It just wasn't enough time for them to get better at pacing. The reason they performed better in the second 800 than the first, and in the third 800 than the second, was that they were just willing to suffer more. The first time you run it, the 800 is probably the most painful running race. Like if you want to see a runner throw up after a race, have them run an 800. It's excruciating. And so these kids, because they'd never experienced that type of discomfort before, they didn't know where their limit was, right? So they ran a certain speed and it really hurt. But when they finished, they looked back and said, you know what? I probably could have gone a little deeper than that. Well, guess what? They got another chance. And when they got another chance, even though they weren't fitter, and even though they didn't pace any smarter, they ran faster because they realized they could hurt a little bit more. And the same thing happened in the third one. So that's why limit testing is important, because you just want to inure yourself I mean, this is not like, it sounds like a little bit machismo, but it's not really that. It's just like, you have to be willing to embrace suffering, to master the skill of pacing. And so just getting a sense of like where your true limit is versus where, fear stops you short of going a little bit deeper into the pain cave is very useful. So you have to be careful, because like in training, you can only go deep into the pain caves so often. But in my book, I provide a few examples of sort of like safe ways or responsible ways to expose yourself to testing your limits in training in ways that won't derail you. And then finally, just a word about macro pacing. I end my book with a chapter on this phenomenon, and macro pacing is just pacing writ large, pacing over broader timescales. I discuss the examples of athletes like the one you see here, Abdi Rahman. Abdi qualified for 5 different Olympics in running for the United States. The 5th and last one at age 43 in the marathon, which is absolutely incredible. If you just look at like it's one thing to reach the top in running or in other endurance sport. It's another to stay there for 20 years, more than 20 years. And certain athletes are capable of doing that. Like, and what makes them different? Well, they're actually good at pacing over a broader time scale. Like it's exactly the same phenomenon, except the time scale is different. And the tools that allow you to do it effectively are slightly different. And so when you look at examples, if you just look at a handful of these athletes who are still just about as good at 43 as they were at 23, you find uncanny consistency. Like there's a formula for this. It's not luck. It's not really genes or anything like that. So number one is be patient. Like a phrase you hear over and over again from these athletes who just keep getting better year after year after year is chipping away. They talk about like, I'm just like, they're not trying to run the greatest race they'll ever run in their next race. They're just trying to take a step forward. So that patient, long view, approach toward like realizing your potential is a key ingredient. That doesn't mean you like don't try as hard as you can in every single race, but you just understand like, no, I can and will and should be better in 5 years than I am in my next race. And so that patience really goes a long way, so to speak. Number 2, don't get greedy. No endurance athlete is immune to if a little is good, more is better mindset. But a lot has been written about Eliud Kipchoge's training. Eliud Kipchoge being the greatest runner who ever lived, marathon world record holder. And what you notice about his training is that it's pretty darn doable. Like Kipchoge does not train harder than most other elite marathoners. He actually trains not quite as hard as they do. And so just like being disciplined and showing a little bit of, don't get me wrong, he trains hard. But if you look at the context of his peers, he's actually keeping some of his powder dry at all times. So, it's tempting when you get into a flow with training and, you start to you can become intoxicated on the fumes of your own rising fitness level and be like, you know what? I'm going to make next week even harder. And then the week after that, even harder than that. And that's when you tend to go off the rails. So don't get greedy as number 2. If you want to have, if you want to just not get on top, but stay on top as an endurance athlete. Be balanced is another. This one's a little bit counterintuitive, but if you look at the world's greatest endurance athletes, they have a lot of other interests outside of their sport. And they have families, they have other hobbies. Abdi Rahman is, he famously just takes a month off from running every year to just go travel. He goes back to Africa to visit family. He's also a party animal. I know Abdi, he's based here in Flagstaff where I am. He likes to tie one on every now and again. He's a big fan of beer. And so just being balanced and just not, because what happens, and there's psychology research to back this up, like when you put all your eggs in the basket of how you perform as an athlete, you're vulnerable. It's almost like an investment portfolio that isn't properly diversified. Like, one bad stock can sink you if your portfolio isn't diversified. And in running or another endurance sport, one bad workout or one bad patch in training can really sink you if that's all you've got going on in your life. So being balanced is also important. Don't let yourself go is another. That's another, like, you know, I'm at an interesting place where because of long COVID, I wasn't able to run for 2 years. So like I let myself go, but it wasn't by choice. But what you see is like, you know, there's a time and a place, especially for amateur athletes like ourselves, when your sport can't be your highest priority and it needs to take a backseat to family or career or whatever else. But in those periods when you, like the way I put it in the book is like, go ahead and put your sport on the back burner. Just don't take it off the stovetop entirely. So like you get yourself into trouble, especially the older you get, it's harder and harder to dig yourself out of a hole of lost fitness the older you get. So even in those periods when, you know, the sport necessarily is not your highest priority, still keep it in the mix, maintain a baseline. You will thank yourself later when it is time to put, you know, your training back on the front burner. And then finally, number 5, which really should be number 1, is the thing you see with the Abdi Rahmans and, you know, the Sarah Halls and all these other athletes who are really good, you know, at age 40 and beyond, is that their passion hasn't waned. And so, you know, we all become endurance athletes because we fall in love with running or triathlon, whatever it is. But when we become competitive, we can actually like lose sight of why we started doing this in the first place. And the numbers and the performances start to distract us. And actually, we start to enjoy the sport less because we're so obsessed with getting better. And honestly, the best way to get better over the long term is to stay in love with the sport, to keep the passion alive. So I encourage the athletes I coach, do whatever it takes to keep that fire lit. And sometimes it means getting away from the sport for a little bit, or being a little bit more balanced, or just doing things that aren't quite by the book because they're fun for you. Like you should give yourself permission to do the sport your way, because it feeds right back into performance in the end. All right, I tried to get through that as quickly as possible. So this is the book I've been referring to, On Pace, available wherever books are sold. It is running specific, but you know, all endurance sport, you know, every endurance discipline they're all cousins of one another. So pacing, basically everything that applies to running vis-a-vis pacing applies to other endurance disciplines as well. Any questions? I can stop the sharing now, actually. There.
Hey, Matt, I have a question about pacing for trail runs. And why I find it an interesting challenge is, you know, like a regular road race, it has hills, you have wind, rain, whatever, but the terrain may not be consistent. And I did one in the fall where there was about a half mile of soft sand.
Yep.
That you had to run through. And afterwards, you get kind of frustrated with it.
Yep.
And because your pace is slowing down, and afterwards I realized, you know, you really need to be patient at that time.
Yes.
You know, or there may be poor terrain where your footing isn't that good. You know, any suggestions?
Yeah, that's a great question. Ultra marathons, virtually all of them take place in, you know, extreme environments of one kind or another. So it's not just how far you have to go, but there's that other, you know, factor as well, the environment, the conditions, and you know, the way, you know, at the highest level, the way I recommend approaching that is use your head. You know, like the thing I didn't really get to touch on, because I was talking a lot about, you know, the perceptual aspect of pacing, but it is also, pacing is a cognitive challenge. There was a really interesting study done with developmentally impaired runners, like very high level runners who were like on the autism spectrum or whatever. And what they found was that they struggled with pacing, that they were not as good. They did not pace optimally as runners of equal ability without developmental impairment. And that's just one of many ways of showing that, like, and also just as we mature, like as our brains develop, we get better at pacing. Women pace better than men, for, you know, partly for this reason. I hate to say so. So when you're out there, it's good to, you know, remember one of Sam Wellemarcora's 5 keys to pacing, or, you know, like how pacing works, is conscious knowledge of, you know, the overall distance and how far you have to go. So you're thinking, you're not calculating the way a calculator does, but you are calculating, like you are making conscious decisions. And so when you're out there and you get a curveball thrown at you in a race, think about it. You know, just, you know, in that moment when you hit the soft sand, you're like, okay, I have never done an ultra in these conditions before. Like, I know that I can sort of grind my way through it, come out the other side and move on, and maybe there won't be any more soft sand. But you're smart enough to know, like, that, you know, that the stress of running on that terrain that it, you know, that it imposes, you know, on your lower legs and feet is going to accelerate local muscle fatigue in those areas, and that could really come back to bite you later in the race. And you know this, like, you know, if you think about it, you're like, you know what, I could force my way through it, but I'd better not. And so you just back off a little bit, and it can be tough because, like, you know, there's so many things going on, like in terms of, you know, I talk about perception of effort as if it's a monolith. Well, no, it ain't. You know, like there are all these little nooks and crannies. Like you can make a long list of all the things you're feeling at any given moment. And so when you're running through that soft sand, like, you know, what you're feeling something that you weren't feeling right before, right? And it's relevant. So that's what I recommend. And, you know, and the thing to understand is that, you know, that quote from Heraclitus, you know, a man can't cross the same river twice because he's not the same man and it's not the same river. Like every single race you do is a one-off. And sometimes the differences are very nuanced, and sometimes they're bigger. Like, you know, there's a lightning storm and you've never run in a lightning storm before. But like, understand that going in, like it is going to be a novel experience, no matter how experienced you are. And so you have to just use your head to navigate your way through the novel elements of the experience. And so running in soft sand is just one of them, but there's just like, you know, there are myriad others.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Anybody have any other questions?
Well, I've got a few more, but I don't want to hog the time here.
Go for it, Ray.
Okay, so I had another question about, you know, there are always, you know, every year there's always a couple of days during the year where you're just in the flow. Yeah, running is easy that day. And it was interesting looking at that graph on perception of effort, because early in a long race, you know, you feel good regardless. But then there's those 2 or 3 times through the year where you feel really good and you feel like you can go for it, but you don't want to push your pace because you don't want to die at the end.
Right.
And I was just wondering, where in the point of, say, a distance race, can you say, yeah, this is really good, you know, you can go for it? Is it halfway through? Is it, you know, 2/3? You know, where is that time where you can say, okay, I can go for it?
Yeah, that's another terrific question. You know, I'm really reluctant to you know, to provide any kind of like universal rule for those situations, because, you know, an example from my personal experience is you know, many years ago, like I was sort of stuck in the half marathon. I was running a lot of half marathons, and every time I ran one, my time was somewhere like from the 118 low to 117 high. And I'm just like, I know I'm better than this, and I want to run faster. And so I came up on my next half marathon, and I thought, like, I am going to run 116 something if it kills me. And I started the race that day, and I forget, like, what my pace had to be like 550 per mile or something like that. So I start off at that pace, and it was one of those days. And I'm like, this is a cakewalk. Like I'm on drugs here. And so in that instance, I decided, because I was experienced enough, I'm like, I'm just going with it, because, like, you know, 535 per mile felt like 550 to me. And so I pivoted right away. and I did not hit the wall. And so, I ran 1:13:15. So I PR'd by more than 4 minutes. And this was not my second or third half marathon. I had run a bunch and I was stuck in that zone. So everything in terms of my experience and knowledge said, this is a fool's errand. Like, you cannot run this fast. But my perception said, no, I mean, it's that easy. And I would really have been filled with regret if I'd been too conservative, you know what I mean, and waited till halfway. No, I tell that story because it's a story worth telling. Like, that is a very unusual circumstance, but like, these are judgment calls, you know what I mean? Like, you know, like, you're not going to hear from the voice of God in these moments saying, here's what you need to do. I'm infallible. You know, you're just making a judgment call, and it's not the end of the world if you do. I mean, it's disappointing to hit the wall and have a bad race, but it's not the end of the world. And you know, one thing I didn't get a chance to say that I try to say every time I talk about pacing is that the road to pacing mastery is paved with pacing failures. So like, that is how you get better. So you do not want to let fear stop you from taking a risk every now and then. You know, like, you want to be, there are such things as foolish risks, but sometimes you just, there are risks worth taking, and even rather big risks worth taking. And like, guaranteed, either it pays off or you learn something that allows you to enjoy the payoff next time.
Yeah, you know, you also brought up an interesting point that, you know, women are typically better than men at pacing. And I've seen some stats for for marathons.
Yep.
Where women have more consistent results for the first and second half of the marathons than men. And I probably throw in your reasons why some people suck at, you know, pacing is definitely ego, you know, for guys, you know, because, you know, and I know I've suffered from this, where you think, okay, I should be hitting this time, you know, regardless of what, you know, race calculator says or something like that. And it took me a long time to really learn how to pace and kind of, you know, trust where I should be, you know, based on my results.
Yeah. Yeah. Men are, I mean, you don't want to paint with too broad a brushstroke and say all men are this way and all women are that way. Obviously, that's not the case. But, you know, in psychology research on risk tolerance, it doesn't really matter what type of risk is, like whether it's economic or health related or sports. Like, by and large, men are more risk tolerant than women. And so when you get to marathons, that leads to hitting the wall. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We're at the top of the hour right now, so I really appreciate you coming on, and we'll be sharing this along to the group and on my blog. So thank you again.
You're very welcome.
Thanks,
I
Matt.
always enjoy these.
Yeah, it was good. Thank you. Great job.
All right. Take care, everyone.